Graveyards conjure up two distinct images. They're either peaceful, sacred places where we come to pay our respects to our loved ones, or they're the scariest places in the world, and somewhere you wouldn't dream of coming on your own when the sun goes down.
But two men from Lancashire have got me thinking again. Steve Chapples and Simon Entwistle are historians with a difference. Their starting point is not the words on the page, but the words on the grave. Together they're working on Northern Graveyard Tales, a series of short films they hope will breathe new life into old stories.
I mean, if you go to a graveyard in France, for example, you can often see a picture of the man. Well, you can actually see the man who is in the grave, and the mere fact you can see him sort of gives it some sort of extra significance. But if you could actually bring the whole story to light, that's what we're trying to do.
Yes, it's history. I think people love history, and like Stephen, I give quite a few talks on famous characters, and this is a really good way of starting from the very beginning.
And is the Northwest particularly good for famous gravestones?
Oh, yes. We could go on for hours and hours about
There's a
it.
lot of material out there, an awful lot of material.
Yeah.
Our tour started in the snow-swept Pennines at Colne Cemetery. Our first grave took us back to perhaps the greatest disaster story of the 20th century.
But this one is a particularly interesting one. As you can see, this is Wallace Henry Hartley, who of course was the violinist on the Titanic, which sank in 1912. And you can see at the bottom here, there is a violin motif, and then above it, it's believed that the very last song they played before the ship went down was Nearer My God to Thee. And so that's why that's there.
Quickly! This way! It's the end, boys. We've done our duty. We can go now.
Hartley's story was immortalised in the 1958 movie A Night to Remember. The bandmaster's decision to play on as passengers fled the sinking ship was seen as an act of great heroism.
I think it was described as like one of the most heroic acts ever at sea, wasn't it?
I was always told that if you survived the Titanic disaster, you were a man, then you were classed as a coward, and the one thing Wallace wasn't was a coward.
A pub named after Colne's most famous son has recently been opened on Church Street. Further down the hill is a memorial built by the townspeople in 1915 for a man they clearly took to their hearts.
The funeral service is just down here, and this whole area was lined. There were 7 bands playing. It was just an amazing sight. I don't think 40,000 people have ever been to Colne before, or since.
Almost like a state funeral, really, wasn't it?
Yes, very much so.
For our next graveyard tale, Steve took me to Home Chapel near Burnley. The grave in question is actually inside the church of St John the Divine.
Steve, this is a really lovely chapel. What's the significance of this place?
Well, I used to come to this chapel as a little boy, but the reason it's here is because of this man, Thomas Dunham Whitaker. He was an antiquarian, he was a writer. He wrote the history of Whalley, Craven, Lonsdale, Richmondshire, and these are big tomes, they're thousands of pages. And so he's a really significant historian, and he's buried here in this vault.
The Reverend Whitaker was clearly an extraordinary man. Not only did he build the chapel he's buried in, he also commissioned early work from the artist Turner. Steve also believes he influenced the novels of the Bronte sisters.
These books were very familiar to the Bronte children, and they used a lot of the characters in here, some from the pedigrees, to find characters for their books and for their own pseudonyms. I started researching these pedigrees, and then suddenly I came across a Howarth, Currer and a Bell. Howarth is where they lived, Currer Bell was her name. And then I found Ellis's in here, which is Emily, and Acton's in here. And then the characters started to come to life as you look at the pedigrees. And nobody else knows this, as far as I know.
I bet that was a eureka moment.
It was. I was literally, as though I'd found hidden treasure.
More people with stories to tell lie in the graveyard outside, including a military leader who became a true Lancashire hero.
What can you read there, Jay?
In memory of General Scarlett. So tell me his story.
Well, basically, during the Crimean War, he led the charge of the Heavy Brigade from the front, and he repulsed 3,500 Russians, saved Balaclava, the port, from being captured, and he only had 300 men with him at the time.
He's a huge war hero.
Inside the chapel, there is a portrait of the general, but to see the artefacts that tell his life story, we went to nearby Townley Hall Museum.
These, I believe, are industrial diamonds.
It's beautiful, isn't it?
It was crafted for him. And there is the inscription. Can you read some of that?
It just says about his gallant conduct is held both as a soldier and a general during the Crimean campaign of 1854. That's absolutely beautiful. That's completely bespoke as well.
Oh, yes. He was quite an exceptional man in many ways. For his time, he did something really important, which is to protect the supply routes to the Crimean battlefields.
Not all the graveyard tales are happy ones, as Simon seemed only too keen to point out.
Simon, just when I start to think that graveyards aren't so spooky, you have started to freak me out again.
This is St Mary's Parish Church here in Clitheroe, one of the oldest churches in the borough with some great stories.
You are into the scary side of it, aren't you?
I do enjoy the ghost stories, and here we have the grave of Mr William Southworth, a local innkeeper. Now his wife found him dead behind the bar with a huge carving knife between his ribs, God bless him. She was of course naturally upset and had the whole story recorded on the grave, which mentions, "Here lies the body of William Southworth, who was stabbed by a neighbour in a moment of ungovernable passion," which must be a Victorian word for very, very angry. Also, leaving a wife and 8 children at the tender age of 42. He died on the 16th of May, 1833. Very sad story, but also a very true story, as the grave tablet tells us.
Does he haunt the graveyard?
He doesn't haunt the graveyard, but he does haunt the public house which he lost his life in.
I feel like we should go.
I think we should definitely go.
And it's a good excuse to have a drink.
Very much so. So here we are, JC, at the Lower Buck in Waddington, one of the oldest pubs in the area. And it's here, way back in May 1833, that Mrs Southworth came downstairs and found her poor husband dead on this very floor in that terrible, terrible month. They say at night time, the pub can be a very, very frightening place to be. Lights flicker, doors slam by themselves, and there's undoubtedly a very, very, very cold atmosphere as we talk at this very moment.
Well, thanks guys. I have learned loads today about the Northwest graveyards, but I have to say I'm a bit more comfortable in the pub than I am in the cemeteries, even if it is a haunted pub. So cheers to that.
Cheers.
So are we.
Well, that's it for this week. Don't forget you can watch again via the BBC iPlayer, and we're back again next Wednesday, 7:30 on BBC One.